Hey guys, today I'll show you a supernatural horror TV series named The Haunting of Bly Manor. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. The drama begins with a white-haired lady who came to a castle in Northern California to attend a wedding rehearsal for a couple. At the dinner, a man was giving a speech about what love should look like, which seemed to resonate with the bride. After dinner, as everyone discussed the wedding within the castle walls, the couple decided to have their wedding and stay the night there before departing for their honeymoon. The castle was rumored to be haunted, often with sightings of a deceased nun crying in the corners. But the groom had been so set on having the wedding there. The groom reassured her by saying the place was a monastery back in the 40s, and with such a long history, ghost stories were not surprising. Suddenly, the white-haired lady asked if they wanted to hear a story, not her own, but someone she knew. With the mood set and the fire lit, they encouraged her to tell the tale, which she prefaced by reiterating that it wasn't her personal experience, but contained various ghosts. In London, 1987, a girl from America named Danny sought a career. She saw an ad for a governess by Sir Henry for his niece and nephew at Bly Manor. Crossing the street, Danny caught a glimpse of someone with gleaming eyes in the car window reflection but didn't seem surprised. She met Sir Henry, and from their conversation it was clear that Danny was to care for his orphaned niece and nephew at Bly Manor. After answering many probing questions, she surprisingly got the job. While at a bar looking at job listings, she bumped into Henry having a drink and toasted to the most awkward job interview of her life, which led to a heartfelt conversation. Henry mentioned that the previous summer they also hired a governess who died at the manor. He didn't reveal how she died, perhaps not knowing himself. Adding to the mystery, the children's parents also passed away, not at the estate, but abroad. Gradually, the manor gained a reputation for being haunted, making it difficult to find a teacher. Henry asked Danny why she came from the US to the UK. She didn't disclose the real reason, only mentioning her desire to pursue a rural education career leading to her successful employment. Back at the hotel, she had covered all the mirrors with cloth. She made a phone call to someone unknown, sharing the news of her successful job application and her hope to stay in the UK a bit longer. Before leaving, she yanked the cloth off the mirrors. As she opened the door, she glanced at the mirror one last time, only to see the same ghostly image with gleaming eyes staring back at her. It seemed she had covered the mirrors to avoid seeing this apparition. Henry had sent a driver, the bearded Owen, to pick her up. Owen was actually the chef at Bly Manor, who also doubled as a driver in his spare time. He was born in the town of Bly, but after spending some time in France to study culinary arts, he decided to stay here to be with his family. Danny arrived at Bly Manor. She heard a girl singing a melancholy tune by the lake, the Weeping Willow. This girl was Henry's niece, Flora, who was particularly affectionate and talkative. She held a doll in her hand and dismissed it as a foolish thing. Danny commented on the beauty of the lake, to which Flora replied with a scoff, saying it was nothing but a stinky pond full of leeches and bloodsuckers, and even animals wouldn't drink its water. Then she pulled Danny away, leaving the doll stuck in the ground. Hand in hand, they saw the nephew, Miles, with the housekeeper, Hannah, standing by. Hannah, who had been staring into the well, snapped out of it and went over to greet Danny, apologizing for being lost in thought. Danny thought Bly Manor was a wonderful place, grand and majestic. Flora warmly showed her around. In the dining room, she saw Owen preparing ingredients. The paintings hanging in the hallways were all originals, and there was also a grand chapel. At the end of a second-floor hallway was a forbidden area, the parents' room of Flora and Miles, who had passed away, now covered in cloth. Lastly, they arrived at Danny's room. Excited to change clothes, Danny was startled to discover Miles peeking through the door crack. Caught, Miles simply walked in, welcoming her and presenting her with a butterfly hairpin. During lunch, Danny made herself a cup of milk tea, but it wasn't popular for Miles. Owen had prepared a feast, truly showcasing his culinary talents. However, he didn't eat as he had to go home to take care of his sick mother, who was not expected to live much longer. Hannah didn't eat either. She took her plate and left, saying she wasn't hungry and would eat later. While bathing Flora in the evening, Danny noticed that she kept looking over her shoulder, as if she was talking to someone. It seemed as though there was someone behind Danny, but there wasn't. Flora's face changed color when she noticed the butterfly hairpin on Danny's head. It turned out that the hairpin was a memento of Rebecca, the previous governess. Suddenly, Flora looked behind Danny again and then said it was fine for her to wear it. After the bath, Danny once again saw the person with glowing eyes in the mirror. She tapped the mirror and the figure immediately disappeared. That night, after putting Miles to bed, Danny went to comfort Flora to sleep. She found her playing with dolls and a toy house filled with various odd homemade dolls. Danny found a Faceless doll under the bedside table and intended to put it away in a box. However, Flora insisted that Danny put it back because that's where the doll belonged. So, Danny did. Before going to sleep, Flora told Danny to stay in her room at night and not to go anywhere else. Danny didn't know why, but agreed anyway. She tossed and turned in bed, finding the night long and restless, so she got up to boil some water. Hearing a noise, she went out to check, but naturally there was nothing. The sound of the boiling water startled her. After making a pot of tea, she prepared to go back to sleep. Then she noticed a figure moving in the hallway, but the night passed without incident. The next day, Flora asked Danny why she hadn't listened to her and had left the room in the middle of the night. Danny was puzzled about how Flora knew. Flora again said that Danny must stay in her room so she wouldn't be seen by her, referring to the lady in the lake. Danny, of course, didn't understand. Suddenly, Miles frightened Flora with a spider, causing her to run away. Danny said she was braver than they thought, and such things wouldn't scare her. Miles said he didn't mean to frighten her. Then he seemed in pain, but quickly became cheerful like a child. Suddenly, Danny saw someone standing on a balcony on the second floor. She greeted him, but he didn't respond and vanished in an instant. Back at the house, the phone rang, but there was no one on the other end when answered. Hannah said they often got prank calls. Then a woman came in. She was the gardener of Bly Manor, Jamie. She appeared cold, but was actually warm-hearted. During dinner, Danny mentioned seeing a strange man on the balcony, but everyone said there were no other staff. Hannah didn't eat, claiming she had already had her meal. After dinner, Danny went to the balcony where she had seen the man. The balcony was outside the forbidden bedroom where everything was covered up. Danny looked around the balcony and found a scarecrow and saw a chapel not far away with lights on inside. She went down to the chapel and found Hannah in a daze. After waking her, Danny showed her the scarecrow. Hannah began to tell Danny about the children's parents, who died 2 years prior, but suddenly changed the subject to the previous governess, Rebecca. It turns out a playboy named Peter had stolen Rebecca's heart and money before running away. Rebecca, heartbroken, drowned herself in the lake, her body facing down, and Flora found her but was indifferent, just staring at the corpse until Jamie discovered them. Danny was confused, but seeing several candles lit in front of her, she asked about their meaning. Hannah said they were lit for the dead, in memory of them. After Hannah left, Danny noticed there were 4 lit candles, one of which was particularly bright, as if newly lit. She knew of the children's parents and the previous governess, Rebecca, but couldn't think of who the 4th person might be. It seems that someone might have just died. Just before bedtime, Danny returned the scarecrow she found on the balcony to Flora, telling her that before she plans to protect others, she should ensure her own safety first. Flora agreed. As Danny left, she accidentally kicked a doll, causing Flora to sit up straight in fright. Suddenly, Miles came in complaining that the room was too hot and asked if she could move the fan from Flora's wardrobe to his own room. Danny opened the wardrobe to look for the fan but couldn't find it. Turning around, she saw the 2 children watching her from the doorway. They locked eyes, then locked the door from the outside, leaving Danny trapped and angry, demanding they open the door. The children claimed it was stuck and sounded scared. After a while, the noise outside ceased, and Danny grew more fearful, especially because of the mirror in the room. She covered the mirror and shouted for help. It took a long time before the children opened the door. Danny scolded them fiercely, saying they would discuss this tomorrow, and sent them to bed. The doll had somehow moved under the cabinet by itself. After leaving the room, Danny noticed a trail of muddy footprints in the hallway. She followed them but found nothing. Turning back, she saw the children had not gone to sleep and were coldly watching her from the window. The next day, Danny learned that muddy footprints would often appear, following a fixed path from the main entrance to the forbidden area and back. The children apologized for the previous day's incident, saying the door had been stuck and it wasn't intentional. Danny chose to forgive them but didn't fully believe their story. Flora retrieved the doll from under the cabinet, but Miles suddenly snatched it and threw it down the house's central pipe. Danny was furious and instructed Miles to mop the floor. Reluctantly, he took the mop while she and Flora planned to retrieve the doll from the basement. Flora refused to go down because she was afraid of the dark, so Danny went alone. Turning on the light, she found the puppet sitting on the floor, having fallen through the pipe. As she picked it up and turned to leave, a person's head emerged from a pile of dolls behind her. After coming upstairs, they discovered Miles was missing. Danny searched and found him sitting in front of a classroom window, lost in thought. He was remembering an incident from 6 months prior when he was still attending classes taught by Father Stack at what seemed to be a religious school. After class, Stack gave Miles a letter from Flora, praised him for his classroom answers, and offered support since his parents had passed away. He advised Miles to read a passage from the Gospel of John, which might help. The passage spoke about joy no one could take away, but Miles didn't understand how it was supposed to help. Miles then climbed a tree and jumped down, fracturing a bone. His best friend offered his lower bunk bed and asked why he was hurting himself. Miles replied he was searching for a key. The next day, Miles got into a fight with another student and almost strangled him. It was found out that Miles started the altercation, but when Father Stack inquired about the reason, Miles wouldn't say. Stack assumed it was due to the grief of losing his parents and tried to console him. However, Miles questioned why bad people could come back, but his parents couldn't. One evening, while Father Stack was packing up, Miles sneaked into the church and killed Stack's pet pigeons, leaving them on a table. This act led to the decision to expel Miles from school, although Stack suggested forgiveness if Miles apologized, considering his background. But Miles refused to apologize, claiming he could have done something even more gruesome. Consequently, he was expelled. Father Stack couldn't understand the sudden change in Miles, who had always been well-behaved. Miles left Flora's letter in the dormitory. It said, "Come back home," and had a drawing of 3 people, with the middle face blackened. Perhaps Miles had acted out just to find a way back home. Time returns to the present. Danny asks the two to tidy up the house. Miles finishes first, and Danny goes to check on the progress. At that moment, Flora is still clutching a doll in her hand. Miles has done a good job. The place is neat and tidy. Elsewhere, Hannah notices cracks appearing in the wall tiles. Jamie arrives, and Hannah mentions that the kids are helping clean up the garden at Danny's request. She plans to combine their punishment with a lesson in nature. Jamie is relieved, happy to avoid the chores. Hannah then remembers the cracks she discovered on the wall and tells Jamie, hoping to get some time to fix them. Once, Danny caught Flora rifling through her belongings, finding a pair of round glasses in the suitcase, one lens broken. Danny wasn't angry, but took the glasses and walked out the door, only to break down crying outside. This item was evidently very important to Danny. Jamie, who spots Danny's distress, knows how to cheer people up and makes Danny laugh. Jamie sets out to fix the cracks Hannah mentioned, but after searching, the wall appears undamaged. While washing up, Danny sees a ghostly reflection in the mirror, eyes resembling round glasses. Before dinner, Miles seeks out Danny, hoping for a private conversation. Danny is curious about the mystery. The phone rings again, Flora answers, but again there's no voice. Miles apologizes for his previous actions, including locking her in the closet and dirtying the hallway, even offering her flowers. Suddenly, Danny sees Miles in a more adult light. Whispering a suggestion, Miles says that Flora might still miss their teacher, Rebecca, and proposes a game to cheer her up, teasing Danny in the process. Jamie discovers the garden has been trashed, instantly blaming Miles. Jamie vows to deal harshly with Miles, but Danny intervenes, suggesting she'll talk to him first. At night, Danny seeks out Hannah, hoping to surprise the children with a game. She asks Hannah to join, but Hannah, who has been sleeping poorly, decides to head back to sleep early. Danny then decides to play a game with the 2 kids. Flora suggests hide and seek, with the children hiding and Danny seeking. After they hide, Danny sets off to find them. Passing through the classroom, a shadowy figure drifts down the hallway. Danny follows the noise to the forbidden area where a family portrait of Flora's family with 4 members and Henry is found on a desk. Passing a window, she enters a room she had previously crossed to get to the balcony, where a music box is open and playing a tune. Simultaneously, Flora, hiding in a trunk, hums the same tune. Something behind her slowly rises. Danny finds a photo in the music box, a handsome man with a girl. While sensing movement, Flora turns and whispers for quiet, and the ghostly figure just lies still. Suddenly, Miles hugged Danny from behind and exclaimed she found him. Now it's his turn to seek and her turn to hide. With that, he ran off. Danny protested that he couldn't go into the forbidden area and told them the game was over, but Miles had already run off out of sight. As Danny saw a shadow dart by, she felt a surge of anger. At that moment, she felt a presence behind her. Turning around, she saw the handsome man from the photograph, giving her a ghostly smile through the window. Danny realized that someone had broken into the house, grabbed a knife, and chased after the intruder, only to find no one there. She threatened to call the police. Suddenly, Miles spoke through the window, saying he felt unwell before collapsing. Hannah arrived upon hearing the commotion, and Danny recounted the sighting of the mysterious man, identifying him as the same man she had seen on the balcony the day before. Miles regained consciousness, and they saw the man standing outside the window. Rewinding to 1 year earlier, the mysterious man Danny encountered was actually Peter, who is said to have caused Rebecca's death. That day, he bought an expensive bottle of wine and met up with Sir Henry, driving a luxurious car, indicating a close relationship. It seemed Peter worked for Henry. On that day, a lady came to apply for the position of a governess, the position Danny now holds. Therefore, this lady was the previous governess, Rebecca. Her credentials were impeccable, with degrees from 2 academies. Peter was curious why someone as qualified as her would apply for a teaching position. Rebecca, of course, gave the typical response about loving children. With Peter's help, Rebecca successfully secured the position and was sent to Bly Manor, where she received a warm welcome from everyone. On her first day, Flora took Rebecca on a tour of the statue garden. Rebecca fell in love with the place at first sight, just like Danny, wishing she could stay forever. And indeed, she did stay at Bly Manor forever. Rebecca often played dolls with Flora, who wanted to make a doll in Rebecca's likeness. When asked about her favorite color, Rebecca said she didn't have one. She loved all the colors. So Flora used every color to make a doll for Rebecca. At that moment, Peter brought Flora a bouquet of flowers, prompting her to tease Rebecca, saying that she thought the flowers were sent to Rebecca. Then Flora handed a single flower to her. Miles questioned whether the garden would be damaged, warning that gardener Jamie would be upset if it were. Miles didn't understand how flowers could cheer someone up so easily. Peter explained that people are like rooms with locked doors, each needing a different key to open their doors. For their Uncle Henry, the key is money or flattery, but for most women, it's often flowers. That evening, a torrential rain began to fall. Rebecca invited Peter to stay in the house for a while, suggesting that it would be better to leave once the rain had eased. With nothing else to do, they started chatting. Rebecca explained that she became a teacher to further her own prospects. She aspired to be a lawyer. Given that Henry was a highly esteemed lawyer, Rebecca believed that if she could take good care of Henry's niece and nephew, she might impress him and perhaps find a shortcut to a legal career. She also inquired why Peter worked for Sir Henry. Peter didn't answer but hinted that he had his own motives. As they talked, their hands somehow came together, yet nothing further ensued. When the rain lightened, Peter bid Rebecca farewell and left. The next day, Peter returned, mentioning that Henry had sent him on some business and that he would be staying for a few more days. Miles asked Peter why Uncle Henry never came to visit, to which Peter said he didn't know, leaving Miles disappointed. To comfort him, Peter gifted Miles his lighter. That night, as Rebecca lay restless in bed, there was a knock at the door. It was Peter. The two got high and dry and naturally performed a fishy hormone yoga. Later, Flora gave Rebecca the doll she had made, which turned out to be jet black because Rebecca liked to mix all the colors. Then came another passionate night. Early in the morning, Rebecca hurriedly got out of bed, saying she needed to wake the children. Despite Peter's desire to keep her in bed, Rebecca got up and left, obviously to Peter's displeasure. After waking up, Peter placed an expensive bottle of wine on the table, which he had taken from the cellar, claiming Henry had allowed it. He then led Rebecca to the forbidden area of the house. In the hallway, Rebecca noticed muddy footprints on the floor, but Peter said not to worry about them. Upon reaching the restricted area, Peter had prepared a surprise for Rebecca, complete with candlelight and music, and even a fur coat that he had found there, deceitfully telling Rebecca that Sir Henry had permitted it. Unable to resist Peter's persuasion, Rebecca tried on the coat. Peter took several photos of her with a camera, and they even took a photo together, the same photo Danny had previously discovered. Just as they were about to get intimate, the housekeeper Hannah came in, reminding them that the children were outside unsupervised. Embarrassed, Rebecca grabbed her clothes and left. An angry Peter warned Hannah to watch her stinky mouth, or he would tell Henry to fire her. Hannah, now furious, retorted that he should try, and if she caught him touching Charlotte's things again, she would kill him and throw him into the lake to feed the fish. Therefore, Charlotte must be the mother of the children. During dinner, Chef Owen let everyone sample his new dish. Rebecca opened her mouth to taste it, but Peter felt jealous. After the meal, Peter began to pack up, preparing to leave. Rebecca asked when he'd return, to which Peter curtly replied, "It's none of her business," and accused her of flirting with Owen right in front of him. Rebecca was taken aback, saying it was just a bite of food. In the end, Peter left, slamming the door behind him. Rebecca was disappointed in Peter, and his story was nearing its conclusion. Back to the present, Danny told everyone about seeing Peter outside the window, and they decided to call the police. Hannah mentioned that Peter had stolen over $200,000 from one of Henry's bank accounts last year, after which he fled and had been missing ever since. They wondered if Peter had returned to commit more crimes. The police did a round without finding anything, and advised everyone to lock their doors and windows before preparing to leave. Hannah said she would report this to Sir Henry. The police, hearing Henry's name, got anxious and said they'd drive around the estate to check once more before departing. This showed Henry's influence in the area. Hannah picked up the phone to inform Owen and Jamie, while at that moment, Danny took a sword and went out, intending to confront Peter face to face. Instead, she encountered Jamie, who was also looking for Peter with a gun. They reached the church and found the candles still burning. Danny blew them out, and they returned to the house. For safety, everyone decided to gather in the dining room for the night. Flora, seeing Hannah without her milk tea, tried to snatch it to drink, but Hannah did not agree. Flora was unusually excited, thinking she could stay up all night, but within half a minute, both children were asleep. The adults discussed how to deal with Peter and suspected that the prank calls were made by him, believing he might have come for Rebecca. He kept calling, wanting to speak to her, but never got through to Rebecca herself and decided to come in person. But Peter did not know Rebecca had already passed away when he fled. Danny looked at a photo of Peter and said, "They really were a match." Jamie sighed, saying that wrong love could destroy a person. Not only did Peter trap Rebecca, but he also trapped himself. Jamie even hoped Rebecca's restless spirit haunted that scoundrel forever. Hearing this, Danny felt bitter inside, suggesting she too had her own story. As the night was well past its halfway point, the people, seeing no incidents, sent the children to bed, each to sleep on their own. However, Danny, troubled by what Jamie had said, tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. In a twist, she saw a hand covered in blood with a watch on its wrist, which disappeared in a flash. It was all a dream. After a peaceful night, Hannah relit 4 candles and looked up to see the same crack again. Danny went to wake the children and found that Miles had already gotten up and gone to Flora's room, but she was nowhere to be found. At this moment, Flora was standing by the lake, gazing intently. Danny hurriedly carried her back inside and looked across the lake, where Rebecca clearly stood. Hannah called for a doctor to check on Flora, who was found to be perfectly fine. When Danny called Sir Henry to report the incident, Henry said to call him if there was a problem, but there was no need to call if everything was all right. Danny didn't understand. Flora clearly hated the lake, so why was she standing there looking at it? The phone rang again that evening, but when Danny answered, no one spoke. Just then, the 2 children came over to announce a story hour, and all the adults gathered in the hall. Chef Owen said that the children would occasionally stage such events. First, Flora performed, pretending to be a cat and telling a story quite beautifully, to warm applause. Next was Miles, whose story was a bit more thrilling and made everyone uncomfortable. Suddenly, the phone rang and Owen whispered a thankful prayer that Peter had come to the rescue. But the call was actually from Owen's neighbor, bringing bad news that Owen's mother had passed away. After everyone bid farewell to Owen, they all left, leaving only Danny behind. As she turned around, she once again saw the ghostly figure, and suddenly it was absorbed into Bly Manor. Who was this ghostly figure? Now we will uncover the mystery. Time turned back to Danny's childhood. The boy with glasses, Eddie, was Danny's childhood sweetheart. They had a special relationship and got engaged as adults, soon to step into the realm of marriage. Since childhood, Eddie had been proposing non-stop to Danny, who had always refused on the grounds that they were too young, until she finally accepted him not long ago. Eddie's parents also liked Danny and even gave her a dress as a wedding gift. Danny looked stunning in the dress, but during a meal, Eddie sensed that Danny was reluctant to marry. From that moment, their relationship began to crack, and the rift was profound. Back in the car, Danny declared her love but said she couldn't marry him. Eddie, puzzled and upset, got out of the car, and just then a car came towards him, his last image becoming a shadow etched forever in Danny's mind. That's why she saw Eddie as a ghostly figure. After learning of Eddie's death at the hospital, his ghost began to follow Danny, all the way to the funeral. At the funeral, Danny covered the mirrors with cloth, and no one found her behavior strange. After all, facing such a tragedy before getting married, most people would crumble. After some time, Eddie's mother found Danny and gave her Eddie's glasses as a keepsake. After bidding farewell to Eddie's mother, Danny left America for London. This was Danny's story from the past, a narrative of love, loss, and the specters of memories that cling beyond death. Back to the present timeline, Owen's mother has unfortunately passed away. Danny is worrying about what to wear to the funeral. Jamie comes over and Danny lets Jamie help her out of her clothes. Suddenly, she sees Eddie in the mirror, but Jamie is startled by her reaction. Danny says it's nothing and then says goodbye to Jamie. She hears someone singing near the church and discovers it's Flora, who is lying on the ground, intending to take a rubbing of the gravestone's inscription. Then they start chatting. Flora mentions her mother died far away, and because they could only bury an empty coffin at the funeral, Danny suggests Flora come back another day to take the rubbing since the ground is a bit wet after the rain. But Flora, holding the paper, runs into the church where Hannah is. Flora kneels down and starts rubbing the inscription on the floor. Danny then talks with Hannah, who didn't attend the funeral because she intended to mourn in her own way by lighting a candle, adding another lit candle to the stage. When leaving, Danny notices the inscription Flora rubbed, which reads, Viola, 1645 to 1680, died at 35, showing the age of the house. In the dining room, Hannah starts cooking. Flora says she doesn't like carrots. Hannah replies that she's not cooking for her, Owen likes them. Jamie soon returns. Owen's mother's death might not be a bad thing because she suffered from dementia and didn't even recognize Owen anymore, so her passing could be seen as a release for Owen from suffering. While Danny is washing dishes, a pair of black hands embraces her from behind. She sees it's Eddie in the mirror. Danny, feeling dazed, decides to go to the corridor to clear her head, but sees Peter by the window. She decides to take out her anger on Peter, grabs a sword, and upon opening the door to attack, she finds it's Owen. Owen jokes, asking if she's comparing him to Peter, saying he's much more handsome. He felt the funeral was too oppressive and wanted some fresh air, ending up driving here without realizing it and deciding to come in. Flora is surprised and asks Hannah how she knew Owen would come back. During the meal, Flora suddenly tells Owen he won't die, confusing Owen. It turns out Flora believes if one's parents die, the child will too. Since her parents died, she felt like a ghost, as if she was already dead. But since others can still see her, she hasn't died. She reassures Owen that death doesn't mean disappearance, so he shouldn't be too sad. Suddenly, Miles says he wants to drink and asks for a glass of Lafitte, which of course is met with disagreement. Miles throws a tantrum, insisting on having a glass of Lafitte to drown his sorrows. Danny firmly refuses and sends the two annoying children to bed. In Flora's room, the door to her toy house opened by itself. Danny took a peek inside and saw all sorts of dolls, arranged just like the layout of Bly Manor. She took out a doll that resembled Peter, but suddenly, Flora insisted on putting it back, saying she had a very special way of arranging them. Then she glanced at the Peter doll in Danny's hand. She looked around and seemed to see someone else behind Danny. After leaving Flora's room, Danny went to Miles's room and told him that they both were similar. She also lost her parents when she was very young, so it's normal to be mature at a young age. She told him he could choose someone else to be his family if he wanted, and if he was willing, she could be his family. After putting the children to bed, the adults lit a bonfire outside and prepared to continue drinking. Hannah's mind wandered again, and the group around the bonfire began to commemorate the deceased, the previous teacher Rebecca, the children's parents, and of course, Owen's mother. Danny did not commemorate her late lover Eddie, as she hoped he would leave her alone. Danny and Jamie returned to the house first, leaving Hannah and Owen to continue drinking. Inside, Danny mentioned that what she saw of Peter might have been a hallucination and shared her past with Eddie, including seeing his ghost. Jamie asked where Eddie was, and if he was present, then jokingly said to let him show up, promising not to exorcise him. Danny laughed and looked at Jamie with affection, then kissed her, revealing her sexual orientation and why she couldn't marry Eddie in the past. Suddenly, Eddie's ghost appeared again, startling Danny to withdraw her juicy tongue. Jamie, thinking Danny wasn't ready, left in a hurry. She came out and drove away with Owen. Housekeeper Hannah seems to be in a daze. It was clear that she had something on her mind. Later that night, Flora suddenly woke up and looked at her toy house, murmuring that Danny had left the room again. Then she saw the Faceless lady's doll appear in the forbidden area. It seems that the toy house must correspond to the real scene because Danny indeed wasn't in the room. Instead, she was wandering around with a bottle of alcohol. Suddenly, Flora and Miles called out to her from behind. Flora said she had a nightmare about something terrifying in the wardrobe, described it loudly, and while Danny was comforting her, a figure was slowly approaching from behind. Danny decided to put the children back to bed, but Flora insisted on waiting, claiming she needed to drink milk, obviously stalling. Danny planned to get milk from the dining room. After she left, Miles opened the door to check outside, and seeing no one, he closed it. After Danny gave Flora some milk, she told her to go to sleep, then continued her solitary wandering with the bottle. At that moment, she noticed 2 trails of muddy footprints on the ground. Danny reached the not yet extinguished bonfire and threw Eddie's glasses into the flames. Looking up, she saw Eddie standing there, but remained calm this time, offering him a drink. By now, it seemed Flora and Miles were intent on protecting Danny from being discovered by some menacing ghost in the house. This was also the reason why they once locked Danny in a closet. It's to protect her. Danny and Jamie have returned to the house, leaving Hannah and Owen to continue their drinks. Owen remarks that they could die at any time, and in death, they might not remember the things that have happened. No past, no future, just the present. The meaning of these words is not clear until now, but it will become clear later. Hannah suggests Owen should go back to Paris while he's young, as staying in this secluded village doesn't hold much significance. Owen, who harbors feelings for Hannah, seizes the opportunity to declare his love, hoping to take her to Paris to enjoy life. Before Hannah can respond, Jamie and Danny come over, and so Jamie and Owen drive home. Hannah is heartbroken, and suddenly in a daze, she finds herself back at the place where she first met Owen when he came to the manor to apply for a chef's position, and Mrs. Charlotte asked Hannah to interview him. They struck up a conversation, with Owen expressing his desire to work as a chef to be closer to home and to stay until his mother passed away. In the midst of their conversation, Mrs. Charlotte and her husband arrived, but as the door opens, Hannah is transported to another place, a different memory. The couple return to the manor, accompanied by Henry and Peter, the first being Mrs. Charlotte and the other being her husband. Pushing the door open leads Hannah to another memory. She steps outside, howling in grief, and here we see that Hannah, carrying memories of the future, has traveled back in time. It's as if she has a complete set of memories, allowing her to traverse back and forth through many significant memories. The multitude of memories interweaving causes her mental breakdown, which is why she's often in a daze. At that moment, Charlotte hears crying and comes to find Hannah weeping because her husband has cheated on her with another woman. In a trance, Hannah finds herself in another place, where she sees Miles pushing Jamie's ladder. Jamie climbs down, ready to hit him, while Miles teasingly comments on Jamie's blushing face, saying it looks pretty. Suddenly, Hannah's head throbs with pain, and she's back to the night around the campfire with Owen telling her the same words. In a blink, Hannah is holding a vacuum cleaner, and Peter walks past her into the classroom. Hannah peers in to see the two arguing over Rebecca eating Owen's new dish that day, but Peter quickly cheers Rebecca up, and they reconcile. Peter, noticing Hannah's sneaky gaze, scolds her and leaves. Hannah turns to find the same crack in the wall, touches it, and her memory shifts again. Hannah enters the forbidden area only to find Peter stealing a necklace worth thousands of pounds, which he is forced to hand over to her. After Peter leaves, Hannah notices another crack in the wall, and in a trance, she's back to when Owen came for the job interview. This time, Hannah says it feels like they've had this conversation before, and Owen agrees, saying it indeed happened, but they must go through it again because it's her memory. They both repeat the conversation, but there are differences from before. It seems Owen also knows a lot about Miles. Suddenly, he yells out for Miles, asking what he's doing. It turns out Hannah has projected her own memories onto an imagined Owen. The camera pans, and she catches Miles secretly smoking. There's no need for alarm here. Just understand that this is all Hannah's memory, and it will all make sense. Hannah confronts Miles about what he's doing. Defiantly, Miles retorts that it's none of her business, reasoning that he is free to step out for a smoke. Naturally, that's not okay, and she scolds him, but Miles doesn't care and heads straight into the church. Hannah follows and enters the church, only to find Charlotte is there, who lights a candle for her. At this point, no one had died, so Hannah inquires for whom the candle is lit. Charlotte says it's for Hannah's husband. Shockingly, although he is still alive, Charlotte wishes him an early death so Hannah can be free. As they talk, the scene shifts once more. Charlotte is gone, and now Rebecca is sitting beside her. Hannah cautions Rebecca not to get too involved with Peter, but Rebecca dismisses her concerns and walks away angrily. Hannah follows and is shocked when she opens the door to a brick wall. As she's wondering, she turns around to see Miles playing with a lighter. In an instant, she's back to interviewing Owen. Owen implores Hannah to face the truth, which is that the manor is like a prison, trapping its inhabitants. Hannah can't listen anymore, pushes open the door only to find herself in Rebecca's bedroom, where Rebecca and Peter are wrestling their muscles. Peter tells Rebecca to pack and flee to America with him and not to tell anyone. He doesn't explain why, he only asks Rebecca to trust him. Choosing to believe him, Rebecca waits as Peter promises to return after taking care of some things. He leaves through the door, apparently not noticing Hannah, who could sneak into their memories. Rebecca then remarks that this is her favorite memory, the most genuine side of Peter before everything went wrong. Suddenly, Rebecca notices Hannah and questions how she could appear in her memory. Hannah is perplexed as she doesn't recall this memory and decides to leave, but Rebecca cautions her that going outside will be frightening. Nevertheless, Hannah exits and bumps into Peter, who is equally startled and asks why she's there. Hannah begins to explain, but realizes Peter isn't speaking to her, but to Flora and Rebecca instead. Miles mentions he heard noises downstairs and suspects something odd in Flora's toy house. They were actually trying to protect Peter. Peter dismisses it and tells them to go back to sleep, but then a faceless lady's spirit emerges from the darkness, grabbing Peter's muscular body and dragging him away. The trail of muddy footprints she leaves behind was actually hers. Known as the Faceless Lady, she took Peter into the forbidden area. Seconds later, he emerges as if nothing had happened. This memory revealed that Peter was killed by the Faceless Lady and turned into a wandering spirit. Miles and Flora are alarmed and ask him what occurred, but Peter seems oblivious. Flora, still holding the Faceless Lady's doll, watches as Peter tries to hold the doll, but it slips through his hands to the ground. He tries several times before he can finally grasp it, once again indicating that Peter is now a spirit. Flora then reveals she has seen the Faceless Lady many times, and the doll was made after her first encounter. She also mentions that others have said it's best to stay away from the Faceless Lady. Peter doesn't know who these others are. As a side note here, these others are referred to other ghosts who are afraid of the Faceless Lady, a figure of terror among the spirits. At that moment, noises came from the forbidden area, drawing everyone's attention. They saw the Faceless Lady carrying Peter's body down the stairs. Full of rage, Peter yelled where she was taking him to and inadvertently slapped Miles. Then something odd happened. Miles started cursing, revealing that Peter had possessed him. This explained why Miles sometimes spoke like an adult previously. Hannah followed the Faceless Lady outside, only to see her dragging Peter's body into the lake, and turning around, Hannah spotted Rebecca's ghost. The scene shifted back to the day just hours before Danny arrived at Bly Manor. Hannah saw Miles playing with a lighter and thought he was going to smoke again, so she followed him. She found Miles standing with Peter by a well. By this time, Peter had been turned into a spirit. Hannah thought he had sneaked back to cause trouble and threatened to call the police. Peter touched Miles, possessed him once more, and then pushed Hannah into the well, where she met her tragic demise. The cracks on the wall she saw were from that day, just seconds before she met Danny. Thus, the first time Danny saw Hannah, Hannah was already a ghost. This explained why Danny saw Hannah was always in a daze, and why Hannah didn't eat, because she was unable to accept the fact of her death and caught in a loop of memories. Meanwhile, Peter watched everyone from a distance. Hannah's memories returned to the night of the bonfire when Chef Owen invited her to Paris. This time, Hannah mustered the courage to accept his invitation, but it was already impossible for her. It was just a memory, and speaking words unspoken in life was futile after death. Moreover, Hannah, now being a ghost, couldn't leave the place and was trapped at the manor. The scene shifts to Henry being in his office, drinking day and night. Danny called to report on the children, but Henry told his secretary not to bother. As long as the children were fine, that was all that mattered. After the secretary left, a figure appeared before Henry. It was none other than his own dark self. Henry opened an envelope and reminisced about the past. Time flashes back to Charlotte having gone into premature labor at Bly Manor. Henry called to bring Charlotte's husband back home, who was away on business, but it was much too early for the birth. Henry decided to call the doctor to the manor to save time. It was on that day Flora was born. Back to the present, Flora woke up on the grass. At the same time, Danny was in the greenhouse, inviting Jamie out for a drink, and Jamie agreed. Peering through the window, Danny saw Flora walking barefoot on the grass and hurriedly went after her. She asked what had happened, but Flora didn't know why she was out there. Before her, Rebecca's ghost stood, explaining why Flora had been talking to the air previously, as she had actually been communicating with Rebecca's spirit. Rebecca touched Flora's forehead, and Flora woke up in bed, realizing she could travel back into her own memories. She found a child in her room, dressed in tattered clothes and faceless, with all facial features blurred. Panicked, Flora sought out her mother, Charlotte, and told her there was a monster in her room. Then, she discovered her Uncle Henry was also in her mother's room, hastily getting dressed, which indicates that the two might be having an affair. But the young Flora wouldn't think much of it. Henry and Charlotte then searched Flora's room but found nothing. After lying down, Flora remarked on feeling much more mature, to which Charlotte explained that when this incident happened, she was only 5, but now she was actually 8. Henry added that these were her memories, and lately, Flora had been falling into such memories more and more. Each time she became conscious of the present, she would wake up. It turned out this was Flora's dream, mixed with her memories, and that Flora had fainted by the lake earlier, and Danny had carried her to bed, where she slept for an entire day. Danny asked Hannah where she had been in the afternoon and why she hadn't been seen. Hannah thought about it and couldn't remember. Danny called Sir Henry again, who remained indifferent. Hannah explained that Henry had changed. He wasn't the same since Charlotte and her husband's plane crash incident in India. Danny, seeing Flora was okay, was about to leave, but felt someone was in the toy house. Indeed, there was someone there. It's the ghostly child Flora had seen earlier. That night, Hannah and Owen agreed to watch the children, allowing gardener Jamie to take Danny out to relax. Jamie brought Danny to her secret spot, where she grew moonflowers that bloom only for 2 months a year, exclusively at night, and die by morning. They need to be replanted annually. Jamie likened life to these flowers, fleeting no matter how hard one tries. Then, Jamie shared her story. Her mother had an affair kept secret from her father, and when it was exposed, people called her mother a prostitute, and Jamie suffered the stigma too. In 1967, her mother left, abandoning not just Jamie but also her newborn brother. Jamie tried to care for him, but realized a child couldn't care for another child. Their family fell apart and their father disappeared. Jamie was sent to foster homes, which weren't kind to her, and eventually she ended up in London and even did time in prison where she learned gardening. Despite her tragic life, Jamie found purpose in caring for the ephemeral beauty of moonflowers. As they shared their passions, the two shared a passionate kiss. Danny slept exceptionally well that night and noticed a scar on Jamie's shoulder, a silent testament to her painful past. Suddenly, Danny saw Flora standing by the lake again from the window and hurried over. It seemed she had fallen into a memory again. After being called by Danny, Flora woke up, and Rebecca's ghost appeared once more, touching to possess her. The possessed Flora apologized for the trouble and said she had to go to eat, then walked away. Flora woke up again in the evening and wandered into the dining room, only to find everyone happily enjoying their dinner. Annoyed, she demanded why they didn't wait for her for dinner. But Miles retorted that she had clearly already eaten. Flora was distressed and loudly exclaimed that she didn't want to play this game anymore. Suddenly, the phone rang. Danny went to answer it and Sir Henry's voice came through. Without waiting for Henry to speak, Danny hung up. It turns out it was Henry who had been incessantly calling Bly Manor. So why was he so persistent in calling? He wanted to speak to Flora, but it was almost never her who answered. On the rare occasion she did, Henry choked up, unable to speak, and would hang up. Alone in his office, Henry drank, his darker side emerging once again, but he was no longer surprised by, even sometimes indulging in with his darker self, a figment that didn't really exist. But the more he drank, the more dependent he became until it turned into an addiction. But what had driven Henry to such depths of despair? Time rewinds to many years before, with Charlotte and Henry passionately wrestling their tongues on the couch. It was quite apparent they were having an affair. On Flora's birthday, Henry gifted her a toy house, an exact replica of Bly Manor. While Charlotte and Henry chatted downstairs, her husband appeared upstairs. They exchanged a glance and a casual greeting before parting ways, as if to ignore him totally. Later that night, Charlotte got up and saw her husband sitting in the dining room. It dawned on him that Flora wasn't his and Charlotte's child, but his brother Henry's. The timing of Charlotte's delivery was too early. By counting back, it was clear that her husband was away when the child was conceived, meaning the child could only be Henry's. Charlotte confessed her cheating after being confronted. This revelation explained why Henry had been trying to contact Flora so desperately. After all, she was his biological daughter. Once the affair was exposed, a major fallout ensued. Charlotte's husband, the elder brother of the family, banished Henry from the family and confiscated all his assets. He then planned to take Charlotte on a trip to India, hoping to rekindle their relationship by reliving their honeymoon. The night before their departure, Charlotte sought out Henry, imploring him to wait a few weeks for her to set things right. Their bond was deep, and with a final tongue massage, Charlotte left Henry behind. Back in the present, what has been shown earlier appears to be one of Henry's memories. His dark side emerges, suggesting they skip straight to his favorite memory. Henry begs for a stop, but he's not in control. The memory overtakes him as the office phone rings. His dark side compels him to answer. It's the British Embassy in India. They report something to Henry that Charlotte and her husband were killed in a plane crash. Henry drops the phone and, surprisingly, turns to face his dark side. Thus, this is the first appearance of his shadow. He decides to inform Bly Manor, but no one answers, so he resolves to go himself. That's the catalyst for Henry's downfall after Charlotte's death. The scene returns to the present, where Flora, asleep, recalls the past. Once, she woke to see a faceless child but wasn't scared this time. Instead, she followed him and found him in the toy house, befriending him. Waking up, Flora breaks down, screaming she doesn't want to play this game anymore, and begging for Rebecca to come out because she has something to tell her. By now, it seems Rebecca's influence keeps pulling Flora back into memories. Rebecca's ghost appears, sits by Flora's bed, and assures her all will be well, then suddenly vanishes, only to reappear later. At that time, Danny hears a noise. She comes for a check and is startled to see Rebecca herself. After the shock, she calls for Flora to leave the room, but they bump into Peter, who stands in the corridor. But soon after, Rebecca and Peter both disappear, and Flora runs away. Danny chases her to the toy house, where Flora apologizes before Miles knocks Danny out from behind. When Danny comes to, she's tied up, and Peter and Rebecca appear. Miles feels it's wrong, but Peter convinces him that right and wrong are not absolute, saying that it was wrong for Miles to kill Father Stack's bird at school, but it brought him back to Flora. To protect her, Miles was right. Flora then tells Danny not to worry because it's just a game. She asks her to be touched by Rebecca, and she can enter any memory. But Rebecca says it's not that simple and vanishes at a strange sound. Peter reassures that Rebecca just jumped into a memory and will return shortly. It seems that even ghosts are sometimes forced into memories. In Rebecca's recollection, the manor's heirloom went missing, and it was Peter who had stolen it. The police were recording statements when Peter had been supposedly killed by the Faceless lady. The officers mentioned it wasn't just the heirloom he stole. Henry had also been swindled out of $250,000. Hearing this, Rebecca realized why Peter had wanted to take her to America. The police mocked her, suggesting she'd been deceived, and questioned whether Peter had told her about the stolen $250,000. Clearly, he hadn't, so they insinuated that Peter never intended to take her with him. Suddenly, the police and Hannah disappeared, leaving Miles standing there. He remarked that the police didn't believe their stories about the faceless creature, and expressed a belief that Peter was still around and wouldn't abandon her. After saying this, he ran off, and Rebecca, following him, found herself lost in another memory. She had just finished her nightly routine when Peter's spirit appeared. She confronted him where he had been, and if he had really stolen the money from Sir Henry. Peter insisted he had never left, that he'd been trying to make himself seen by her for days, and he finally succeeded. He asked her to extend her hand, telling her that only death could separate them, and then passed through her hand, making her realize Peter was indeed dead. From that moment on, Rebecca frequently visited the forbidden area to meet with Peter's spirit, their love persisting beyond the grave. Even though Peter was dead, Rebecca wanted to continue their life together, proposing they still go to the US, a country good for the ghostly life. Even if intangible, at least they would be together. Peter replied that it was impossible. As a spirit, he couldn't leave the manor's boundaries, or he'd be pulled back to the place of his death, the very spot they were standing. Rebecca, overcome with emotion, screamed and cried like a chicken, and Peter tried to console her by possessing her sexy body, but he quickly withdrew, still unclear as to how possession worked at that time. One day, Peter attempted to possess Rebecca in an effort to leave Bly Manor using her body. Nevertheless, the attempt failed. Following this, Peter vanished for a week, only to reappear having diligently practiced and finally figuring out a way for them to be together forever, which was through permanent possession. After chanting the spell, Peter was forever attached to Rebecca. Peter gained his freedom, but Rebecca became trapped in an endless stream of memories. As time went by, Peter felt increasingly empty, and one night he walked Rebecca's sexy body into the lake to wet herself. Upon entering, he saw his own decomposing corpse and realized something was amiss and that he might have been manipulated by the faceless ghost in the lake, but it was too late. This incident caused Rebecca to drown in the lake, making her forever unite with Peter. The next day, Rebecca's spirit was in despair as she observed her own lifeless body. The later happenings are shown as earlier. Flora was the first to find Rebecca's body, face down. She stood motionless previously because she saw Rebecca's ghost on the opposite shore. Jamie discovered Flora and then called the police. From that point on, both were caught in an endless nightmare. Peter kept telling Rebecca that he seemed to have found a way to change everything, but it would require time to prove. Back to the present timeline, just as Rebecca was diving into her memories, Peter also heard a knock at the door. He thought it might be one of the manor's staff, so he asked Miles to tell a white lie to cover for him. However, Miles responded that he didn't hear any knocking. This implies that Peter was also caught up in his own recollections. In his memory, he recalled the time after his mother was released from the psychiatric hospital and planned to turn to him for help. Unwilling to beg Peter's father or to live on the streets, she felt her only option was to rely on Peter. Peter, however, suspected his mother was in cahoots with his father to deceive him. When she realized Peter was not going to agree, she threatened to blackmail him. If Peter refused to take her in, she would go to Sir Henry and spill the beans about all the bad things Peter had done. It was clear that Peter's life was quite miserable. At first, this memory didn't bother him much, but the more he visited it, the more tiresome it became. Every time he heard a knock on the door, he'd be triggered and plunged back into this memory. Finally, Peter came back to the present from his memory. He saw the children trying to set Danny free and immediately possessed Miles to prevent Flora from doing so. After leaving Miles's body, Peter explained that he meant no harm. As they conversed, Rebecca also returned to her senses from her memories, and they prepared to continue their plan. Their scheme involved possessing Miles and Flora, deceiving them into thinking they were being sent to the Eternal House to play, thus freeing them from the agony of constant memory jumps. Rebecca had been making Flora relive memories over and over to make her detest them enough to consent to the possession and escape the pain. Rebecca suggested that they should wait, but Peter pulled out the faceless lady ghost dressed in ancient clothes, insisting they couldn't wait any longer or they would end up like the faceless lady, soulless and alone. Flora and Miles were unsure if this was a good idea, but Peter lied, saying that by entering the Eternal House, they would be able to see their parents again. Hearing that, they agreed happily. What followed was the possession and the chanting of the spell, after which Peter and Rebecca both vanished. Miles, now under Peter's control, found Flora and asked if she was Rebecca. The possessed Flora replied affirmatively. Then they heard the housekeeper Hannah calling for them, so Miles instructed Flora to get rid of Danny. They hadn't wanted to resort to murder, but since Danny knew too much, they had to go. After saying this, they left to find Hannah. Meeting Hannah, the possessed Miles told her that she was still a ghost who hadn't come to terms with reality, and he would show her the truth. He then led her to the well, explaining that over time her face would fade away, just like a forgotten memory. Hannah, confused, looked down the well, and then everything became clear to her. She was once again lost in the memory of her first encounter with Chef Owen. This time, she confessed her heart, saying that she was already dead and she loved him very much. Owen nodded, then he disappeared. Inside the toy house, Flora did not kill Danny but intended to save her. She had already conspired with Rebecca to put on a show for Peter. It turns out Rebecca had not actually possessed Flora. Flora naively thought it was just another game. Rebecca said there was no more game and she needed to take Danny and get as far away from the manor as possible. As they reached the front door, Flora realized this was no longer a game and was reluctant to leave. Suddenly, the faceless lady appeared, grabbed Danny, and dragged her heavy body into the manor. So who was this faceless lady? Let's turn back the clock, way back to the 15th century. At that time, the lord of the manor had just passed away, lying in bed. He had no sons, only 2 daughters, Viola, the elder, and Perdita, the younger. We have come across the name Viola before, on a gravestone that Flora had rubbed in the church. After the burial of their father, the sisters faced the urgent problem of needing to marry. In feudal society, it was impossible for women to control family property. If they did not marry, they would lose their financial authority, including the rights to Bly Manor. The sisters were very close and relied on each other for support. Both were quite attractive, so many men came calling. But Viola knew that these men were only after their family estate, so the sisters desired to maintain their power. Thus, Viola approached a distant cousin named Arthur, giving him the choice to marry either of them but under their supervision. Arthur ultimately chose Viola, and Perdita happily accepted this outcome, also blessing her sister. During the vows, the priest pointed out that Viola had omitted the word obey. The line was supposed to be to love, cherish, and obey her husband, but Viola refused to say it. Both the 2 sisters knew that obey was out of the question. After reclaiming their manor, Viola's restlessness began to stir within her. She often woke up in the middle of the night to wander about. She also started to feel that there was some truth to this marriage. Immersed in it, she let the pretense become reality. Soon, Viola and Arthur's daughter was born, and the 3 of them enjoyed a period of happiness. However, Viola always felt something was amiss. In time, she contracted a lung disease but didn't pay it much attention. Viola had a particular fondness for clothes and jewelry and had amassed a collection of treasures because they could afford it. Arthur didn't stop her. In fact, he indulged her. But Viola's lung condition worsened. They had a doctor examine her, and thankfully it was not the plague. Though not the plague, she still needed to keep her distance from the child. The doctor pronounced that Viola wouldn't live more than a few months. Arthur then moved her to a guest room. They tried everything, even bringing in a priest. There was a prayer that Viola needed to repeat about going to the place God had prepared for her should she die. Viola, however, indifferently told the priest to inform his god that she simply wouldn't go, and miraculously she lived on for several more years. Their daughter once wished to dance before bedtime. Arthur danced a few steps with her, but the little girl also hoped Perdita would dance with her father so she could learn. But as they were dancing, they turned and saw Viola, who said in anger that she didn't want to miss out on her own dance, so there's no need for Perdita to dance with her husband on her behalf. After saying this, she vomited on the floor. When Perdita hurried to help, Viola slapped her across the face. Every night, Viola would get out of bed and wander aimlessly, singing the sorrowful song, The Weeping Willow. Although she seemed close to death, she just wouldn't die. She often felt like slapping her sister, but lacked the strength. Perdita blocked her many times, so Viola resorted to sneaking attacks. One day, Viola instructed the butler to place all her clothing and jewelry into a large chest, expressing her wish for them to be left to her daughter after her death. No one other than her daughter was to have these treasures, and she charged Arthur with their safekeeping. As husband and wife, Arthur naturally promised to honor her request. As time passed, the family's fortunes began to decline. Arthur was forced to travel for business. During Arthur's absence, Perdita shed all pretenses. Once, while Viola was suffering from a severe coughing fit, Perdita comforted her but was suddenly struck by a malicious thought. She smothered Viola, ending her vulnerable life. After Viola's death, Perdita showed no fear, only a sense of relief. Following the funeral, in accordance with Viola's will, Arthur sealed the chest filled with exotic treasures and placed the key inside an envelope. However, Perdita discovered where it was hidden. Arthur had suddenly become a lonely widower, and many women sought his hand in marriage, but he rejected them all. Eventually, he chose Perdita, and the two were secretly wed in a church, where Viola's name was already etched into the floor. The portraits of both the former and current mistresses of the house were hung in the hall. After the marriage, Perdita bore no children of her own and hoped to raise Viola's daughter. However, the girl did not acknowledge her as a mother. One evening, Perdita felt something unusual about the portrait of her sister, but upon looking back, it seemed unchanged. She approached Arthur with a desire to open Viola's treasure chest, especially now that their business was failing and they were close to selling off their property. But Arthur refused, determined to keep his promise to Viola. They argued many times over this matter. Perdita wondered why she had to live in silence and poverty while her sister lived in wealth. And so, driven beyond endurance one day, Perdita secretly took the key from the envelope, not hesitating for a moment. She intended to open the chest in the storeroom, which later became Flora's toy house. Flora had once hidden behind this chest during a game of hide-and-seek. As Perdita opened the chest and admired the treasures and a lavish dress her sister had left behind, a pair of hands suddenly reached out and strangled her to death. The next day, Perdita's body was discovered by Arthur in a particularly gruesome state, seemingly drained by a vampire. To understand the sudden plot, we must turn back time to when Viola was smothered. Contrary to ascending to heaven, she awoke within these walls. Suddenly, her illness vanished, but the doors were unopenable and the windows sealed. Opening a wardrobe, a layer of gauze floated down. It turns out her soul was trapped inside the house-like chest. She could not leave, and upon looking in the mirror, she found her visage restored to youthful beauty, but to no avail, as she could not exit from the chest. Thus, she slept, woke, and wandered every day, enduring a monotonous routine. With each awakening, her memory seemed to fade, repeating for an unknown duration. She once noticed her reflection rotting, and yet she slept and wandered again. Over time, she came to accept her death. Her reflection eventually withered to a skeleton, but she knew one day the door would open to the right key. She yearned for her daughter, but when the door finally opened, it was not her daughter, but Perdita. Realization dawned, and without hesitation, she strangled Perdita. Hence, the ghost haunting the toy house is revealed to be Perdita. After that, Viola felt little joy upon seeing Arthur, and after another slumber, Perdita's name appeared on the church floor. Afterward, Arthur lost his business and estate. He and his daughter sold Bly Manor, seeking a small, tranquil place to live out their days. Viola's soul lingered in the manor, awaiting reunion with her husband and daughter. But they discarded the treasure chest into the manor's lake, as Arthur deemed it a vessel of disaster, not wealth. This felt like total abandonment to Viola, and her heart broke further. Her power grew, affecting the entire estate. Each night she awoke, wandered, then slept, the path from the manor to her old bedroom, hoping to find her family, only to be met with emptiness, shattering her heart anew. The muddy footprints on the corridor grew colder. Thus, she witnessed time and change as Bly Manor became a quarantine during a plague 10 years later. A stranger lay in her bed, and when a doctor tried to evict her, deeming it unsafe, but he soon learned he was in the greatest danger. Viola strangled him, and he too became a ghost through her vengeful power. This cycle continued, her memory fading into a haze, her visits to the manor and her room becoming less frequent. Her every appearance in the toy house means she emerged from the lake where the chest was dumped. Gradually, Viola forgot her purpose in her old room, killing anyone she encountered with her vengeful power. Time mercilessly eroded everything, memories, spirit, and eventually her face, until she couldn't recall her own name or those of her husband and sister, only a vague sense she sought her daughter. This is how Viola ended up being the menacing, faceless lady spirit. One day she found a child on her bed, unsure if it was her daughter, and led her into the lake, resulting in the child's death and transformation into a faceless being, the faceless child that persistently appeared in Flora's room. Those Viola killed all became faceless, like the doctor who only remembered his profession. This fate befell all trapped in Bly Manor, including Perdita, worn by time in the toy house, and recently deceased Peter, Rebecca, and Hannah. Back to the present timeline, the ghost Hannah was still trapped in her own memories of the time when Owen came for an interview, a memory that clearly left a deep impression on her. Owen told her not to be forever lost in her own recollections, but to bravely look forward and go save others. Heeding his advice, Hannah stepped forward and saw Viola dragging Danny towards the manor. Hannah tried to intervene but passed right through Viola's body. Viola then dragged Danny into the forbidden area. Suddenly, Flora rushed to the bed, pleading with Viola to let Danny go. Upon seeing Flora, Viola mistook her for her own daughter and released Danny. She picked up Flora and started walking towards the lake. Ghost Peter and Rebecca also appeared, with Peter lamenting that he gave Danny a chance, but she chose to forsake freedom. At that moment, Henry also arrived in his car, presumably having come to a realization. Seeing Henry, Flora shouted for help as if he were a lifeline, and Henry rushed forward in an attempt to rescue her, only to be hit badly. After regaining her senses, Flora quickly ran out, but it was in vain. Meanwhile, Owen and Jamie drove up, unaware of what had happened. Hannah approached them, asking what they were doing there, if they had come to add to the casualties. It turned out Owen and Jamie had nightmares, which led them to check in. Hannah urged them to go save people. Ghost Rebecca also wanted to save Flora, but ghosts could not touch Viola. As Viola was about to carry Flora into the lake, Rebecca decided to possess Flora, hoping to spare her any pain. Flora then entered into her memories, reuniting with her mother Charlotte in her recollection. Owen, seeing Henry on the ground, quickly administered CPR. Danny caught up to Flora and, out of desperation, recited a spell. However, it wasn't intended for Flora, but for Viola. Danny planned to let Viola enter her own body and trap her inside in order to save Flora. The plan was successful. Ghost Hannah, knowing she would soon vanish forever, asked Henry's soul to tell Owen to check the well to understand everything, and to tell him she loved him. But fortunately, Henry was saved by Owen and did not die. Peter also left Miles's body and offered him a sincere apology. Because Viola possessed Danny, her power disappeared, and all the ghosts trapped in the manor were set free and vanished forever. Although Viola had taken over Danny's body, Danny's spirit was not consumed. It was because Viola's weakened power simply couldn't consume that body with strong will. Afterward, Owen discovered Hannah's body in the well and learned she was long murdered by a possessed Miles. Amidst his grief, he gave Hannah a proper burial and lit a candle for her in the church. Henry planned to take Miles and Flora to America, leaving behind their old lives. Danny appeared untroubled on the surface, but she always had the nagging feeling that Viola was merely lurking, biding her time to one day emerge and consume her soul. She could always sense that Viola was inside her, quiet, yet not at peace. The angry, lonely, and empty beast could leap out at any moment. Jamie told her lover Danny that she was willing to stand by her and face that beast together. As Danny and Flora said their farewells, Flora handed her a doll she made. It's a miniature of Danny. Everyone said their goodbyes, each embarking on a new journey in life. Danny and Jamie planned to stay in the United States for a while and then drift wherever life took them, living day by day. That was the plan, but the two lovers never left. They stayed in London. A year later, Jamie gave Danny a moonflower. 2 years in, they moved into a new home together. In the 3rd, 4th, and 5th years, their love was unwavering, and life was peaceful and beautiful, until one day Danny caught a glimpse of Viola, who had been hiding for years, in a reflection in the mirror. At that moment, Danny knew what she had to do, and carried out a plan she had long considered. She presented Jamie with a potted plant to tend to. As Jamie investigated the roots, she found an engagement ring, and so the two became lawful partners. Later, they made a point of visiting Chef Owen, who had opened a restaurant and continued his passion for cooking. They shared a drink, and in the reflection of the glasses, Danny still saw Viola. Owen mentioned that Henry had visited with the children, and Flora had a boyfriend. To their surprise, Flora was already 17. Interestingly, when the topic of the terrifying events of Bly Manor came up, both children had completely forgotten them, not even recalling who Hannah was. However, they had a vague impression when shown a photograph. This is quite normal, really. When everyone tries to remember things that happened around the age of 10, many details are indeed hazy. Memories fade with time, and perhaps that's for the best. At least the children aren't afraid anymore. Owen encouraged them to look forward and not to live in the shadow of Bly Manor. After returning home that evening, Danny was washing dishes when she once again saw Viola in the sink. Jamie noticed Danny seemed troubled and asked her what was wrong. Danny shared that it seemed as if Viola was trying to emerge from her body. Jamie could only offer comfort. There was nothing else she could do. One day, when Jamie came home, she found the house flooded with water. She went to investigate and saw Danny had filled the bathtub with water and was staring blankly at Viola's reflection in it. Jamie called out to Danny, waking her from her trance. Danny confessed that she was afraid she might become Viola someday. Jamie assured her she would always be with her. That night, Danny had a nightmare in which she dreamt she was strangling Jamie in the water. In reality, her hands were on Jamie's neck. The next morning, Jamie woke up to find only a note left by Danny. It's clear Danny decided to leave to protect Jamie, realizing the beast within her was about to break free. Without hesitation, Jamie drove back to Bly Manor and plunged into the lake, where she saw her lover Danny looking as if she had never died. Jamie pleaded with Danny to take her away, but the ghost in the lake was now not only Viola, but also Danny, and Danny would never harm Jamie. Jamie couldn't seek her death that way, and she emerged from the lake with only her tears mingling with the lake water. From then on, Jamie would leave the door ajar each night, just in case Danny returned. The scene shifts back to the white-haired lady who concludes the story. Day by day, the ghost's body in the lake gradually fades away. She no longer remembers Jamie or their life together. All details seem to have vanished like smoke, but the memories of Danny will forever be etched in Jamie's mind. After the story, the white-haired lady is in tears, and the audience is deeply moved by such a touching love story. One of them expresses a desire to visit Bly Manor in England. However, the white-haired lady says that she can take a try, but she won't find it. There is a man who is also holding back tears. He glances at his watch and remarks on how late it's gotten, noting that tomorrow is a day of great joy and suggesting it's time to sleep. He gently pats the white-haired lady and leaves, followed by an elderly man. The bride, staying behind, reflects on how she feels different after getting married and shares her fear of losing the ones she loves. The white-haired lady advises her not to focus on loss, but to enjoy the time living with her loved one, cherishing the memories that make an impression and holding on to those memories. After a hug, they prepare to go to sleep. Suddenly, the bride turns and mentions it's a coincidence that her name is the same as a character in the story. Indeed, she is the very Flora from the tale. At the wedding the next day, the white-haired lady stood by the table, watching the dancing crowd with a smile. The man who had shed tears just the night before was now toasting her. It turns out to be Owen, the gentleman who was fervently discussing love yesterday. And the boy beside him is the grown-up Miles, while the elderly man is actually Sir Henry. But who might the white-haired lady be? That's Jamie. Jamie returned home, leaving the door cracked open, still waiting for the one she loves deeply. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.